Hello everyone, Fungustober here. If you are in the space news scene at all, you might have seen that the recent audit of NASA's space launch system recently happened. And, well, I enjoy space. I think space is cool. And so I read a bunch of this stuff, and so obviously you've seen the headlines that are like, new NASA audit reveals the SLS program is unaffordable. NASA's SLS rocket is $6 billion over budget. NASA expects it'll spend $6 billion on a rocket that's 6 years behind schedule. NASA's massive moon rocket will cost taxpayers billions more than projected, auditor warns Congress. Like, you've seen that. If you're like most people, you're probably going, oh no, the SLS project is doomed. There's going to be no hope for this. They're going to shut it down because it's wildly over budget. How could this have ever happened? I can't believe that they're this far over budget if it's billions. The problem with this is that it doesn't really put things in perspective. If you just hear, oh, they have this much money, and there's nothing to compare that to. So let's get rid of all the bullshit in the way, and let's look at this in a contexted way instead of a contextless way, because having context for things makes everything a lot simpler to just parse and figure out what's actually going on, instead of the sky is falling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling, we're all gonna die sort of mentality that the news tends to have, because it's more interesting than going, this guy said a thing. So let's look into this. The budget for NASA in 2023 is $25 billion. And that's over 1 year, to be clear. So let's just put this up on this little chart here. $25 billion for to launch rockets and stuff for a year. Blech. NASA has a lot of different projects that it has to keep running. It has to pay people. So obviously it's expected that they've got to spend a decent bit of money. Like, making spacecraft isn't cheap, and unless you want it to fail spectacularly. So let's look at some costs of the SLS program. Of course, let's start with what the SLS is getting over the next 4 years, 2024 to 2028. That is $11.2 billion. That is $11.2 billion US dollars. And that's over the next 4 years. 11.2 divided by 4 is about 2.8. So they're spending about 2.8 billion a year on SLS over the next 4 years. At least that's what they're expecting. And $2.8 billion a year over the $25 billion per year is about 11% of the budget. That's pretty fair. Like, you're making a moon rocket that doesn't come cheap. Let's look at SLS so far. That is from 2011, which is, to note, 12 years ago, which is when the SLS program started, 2011 to 2023. That is 11 years. It has taken 11 years for the SLS to go from just nothing to where we are now, which is having sent a rocket around the moon for the first time in 50 years. And you're probably thinking, oh, if the budget for 4 years is 11.2 billion, then what it took for 11 years must be a lot higher, right? Kind of. If a lot higher, you mean $600 million higher, because from 2011 to 2023, they spent $11.8 billion. 11.8 divided by 11 is that's $1.07 billion per year. That's well, okay, some of you are probably doubting me. Well, let's look at the Saturn V development, which was from 1964 to 1973. Adjusted for inflation, what they spent was $36.9 billion over the entire 9-year development period for the Saturn V. That is, again, from 1964 to 1973. That obviously doesn't account the spending they had to do for the Saturn I, and the Saturn 1B, which were also part of the Saturn program, but I think I should probably also include it, but off to the side. So let's quickly do that then. Okay, so if we want to factor in the Saturn I development, because the Saturn I development sort of was part of the Saturn V development, because they wanted to make the Saturn I first to test stuff, and then the Saturn V, and the SLS will have later blocks like the 1B. So sure, let's add that stuff in. I didn't manage to find development costs for the Saturn 1B, which who cares about the Saturn 1B? Saturn 1 development was from 1958 to 1963, so 5 years, and the costs of that were about $9 billion in today's money. Small mistake, I calculated things a tiny bit wrong, and the Saturn 1 development costs should actually be closer to 8.2 billion instead of 9 billion. Not that that changes much, but like, it's something. And so, if we go back to, so if we combine Saturn 5 and the Saturn 1 together, that's $45.9 billion over 14 years, which is quite a bit more than what the SLS has spent over 11 years. In fact, it is, for only 3 more years, it is about 3.8 times larger of a cost. And that's in 1950 to 1970, and which everything is a lot more expensive than it was in the 1950s and 1960s, because that was 70 to 50 years ago. We're in the 2020s now. So it's been around 50 to 70 years, and we've somehow gone backwards in cost to our moon rocket. Some people probably still aren't convinced. They're like, okay, you've largely used these numbers, these meaningless numbers next to each other, and sure, it may be a bit cheaper than the Saturn V development, but who cares? Well, I'm going to put all of these numbers in perspective, because the US military budget in 2022 was $766 billion, and that is over a single year. In a single year, the US military spent more than the SLS budget for 2024 to 2028, the SLS from 2011 to 2023, the Saturn V development from 1964 to 1973, the Saturn 1 development from 1958 to 1963, and the Saturn 1 development and Saturn V development combined. All of that does not even get to a fourth of the US military budget. That is utterly insane of a number. You cannot really put this into words. $11.8 billion is about 1% of $766 billion. 1% of that went to the SLS over 2011 to 2023, which is 11 times more time, but nearly 100% less money. Even the Saturn V and the Saturn 1 development pales in comparison to it. A long time ago, things cost a lot less, but now they cost more. And now, despite things costing more, the government wants NASA to do it in less money. Oh, and of course, this isn't even forgetting the fact that the Saturn V was basically just made from scratch. The Saturn 1 and the Saturn 1B were basically just made out of old Redstone and Jupiter tanks. They just basically took a bunch of them and tied them together, but the Saturn V was basically built from scratch. A big problem with SLS is that they've basically been told by the government, hey, you have to reuse all of the space shuttle stuff to make this new rocket, which I feel like maybe there's a reason why they have had to spend so much money on a rocket that requires them to retrofit old hardware that wasn't meant to do this. Like, some of those development costs are just up to like making the solid rocket boosters go from the segments they were on the space shuttle to the number of segments they are with SLS. Like that's at least got to take like years of development at least, and like hundreds of millions of dollars. But this isn't even talking about like the tanks, the engines. Have I talked about the engines? The engines weren't meant to do this. They were meant to carry an orbiter into space, not this entire thing. So obviously you've got to make that work, and then you've got to have 4 of them instead of 3, so you've got to mess with the plumbing level, and then things are just insane. And the amount of people just not understanding a thing about it and going, money, that's expensive, whoa. Yeah, there's probably a reason for it being expensive. Oh, and lest we forget, there was an entire different program before SLS that was supposed to do this, except it was entirely disastrous, and it's just... I feel like having to recover from that at least factors into the equation of costs, at least just a little. There's just so much stuff that they have had to do. Oh, and then... I keep doing this. And then there's the whole thing where NASA has to, like, have contractors all over the country and partnerships in Europe. And that also takes some development time and some development money, because, like, you've got to pay for, like, slightly more expensive services just for the sake of diversifying where all your parts come from, and not just, like, making them under one house. And I think it's supposed to be good for the economy. I don't know. A lot of SLS's problems don't come from, like, NASA and leadership. A lot of it is handed down from Congress itself. So I feel like instead of going, well, the NASA's over budget, that's kind of weird, the congressman should be going, man, we should probably lighten the load on them a bit, instead of giving them so much shit to deal with. Maybe we should think about how. Post-editing Fungus here after an entire day of editing. I want to just add a few little addendums here. First is, some may ask, well, if you're yelling about all this, do you think that NASA shouldn't keep track of how much they spend? And no, I do think that people should keep track of on how much NASA spends, just because, like, I think it's a good thing to keep track of where your money's going, just in case someone out there has it out for you. I just think people should stop losing their heads about it, because, like, a lot of the problems come from the fact that this is a government agency, and so they're beholden to what the government tells them to do. I'm also not saying that the SLS program is inherently flawed either. It's got some problems with it, but I don't think it's going to, like, explode. This is the first time that we've gotten a human-rated spacecraft around the moon in 50 years. That is so much time. I don't think people really understand that, because, like, it's just a long time. They've got to be doing something right to get it to work, because they did have a successful test with Artemis 1. There were delays, but it got done, because I'm of the opinion that if, the old quote of Miyamoto's that probably isn't actually a Miyamoto quote, and people just keep attributing it to him because they saw it on the internet somewhere, of a delayed game is eventually good, a rushed game is always bad. I think it's kind of like that with the rockets, except if you rush it, bad things happen. I really just don't think a lot of this is as big of a deal as a lot of people are making it out to be. Speaking of that, watch the Jet Propulsion Laboratory's video, JPL and the Space Age, The Breaking Point, because it talks about the faster, better, cheaper era of the JPL, and how that was ultimately their downfall in a few missions, because faster isn't always better, and cheaper is almost never safer, because you can have 2 of 3, but you cannot have faster, better, and cheaper at the same time. Some might ask, well, don't like individual SLS rockets cost more than an individual Saturn V? I think, again, there's the whole retrofitting thing, and there's also just a bunch more stuff you need to put in rockets nowadays, like so many sensors, computer systems, Like, I don't think it's really that surprising that a 2020s rocket is more expensive than a 1970s rocket, even if you, like, adjust for inflation, because there's just more stuff. Plus, we've only put humans on the moon one other time, that being back in the 1970s. So there's not really much to compare it to other than that one time. So it might really just be expensive now, and we just don't know it because we haven't been putting people on the moon for so long. And some yet may ask, what point does the SLS even serve? Why can't NASA just use something like Starship to get to the moon? And you see, different rockets are meant to serve different purposes, and the Super Heavy, the Starship Super Heavy, sacrifices some of SLS's lifting capabilities to be able to be quickly reusable. Starship would probably need multiple refuelings to get to the moon, which means it would take several launches of Starship to actually make that happen. And here's a novel concept. Instead of having 5 different rockets launched to get to the moon, increasing the risk of failure as more and more logistics are introduced, we could use 1. Also, NASA can't use Starship because it hasn't even managed to get out of the atmosphere yet, while SLS got the Orion capsule around the moon and back to Earth safely. So yeah, that's all. Bye.